The nurses said she flatlined twice on the table. Twice her heart stopped beating during the 7-hour emergency surgery to repair the ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm that should have killed her on the kitchen floor of the farmhouse she'd lived in for 61 years. Twice the surgeons brought her back, their hands moving with mechanical precision inside the chest of a 78-year-old woman whose body had every reason to quit, but whose stubborn heart refused the invitation. Agnes Marlowe did not die on that operating table in September of 2023, though her children had already begun behaving as if she had. She woke 4 days later in the intensive care unit of St. Jerome's Regional Medical Center, tubes running from her arms and chest, monitors beeping in steady rhythms that measured the life still pulsing inside her, and a fog of morphine softening the edges of a world that had changed completely while she was unconscious. She couldn't speak yet. The ventilator tube down her throat prevented that. She couldn't move much either, her body pinned to the bed by pain and exhaustion and the sheer weight of what 7 hours of open surgery does to a person her age. But her eyes worked, her ears worked, and her mind, sharp as it had been at 30 or 50 or 70, worked perfectly well. That was how she heard them. Her own children, standing just outside the glass partition of her ICU room, talking about her as if the glass were a wall and the monitors were loud enough to drown out their voices. They were wrong on both counts. The farm's already listed, said David, her oldest, 56 years old, and carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd spent 3 decades in commercial real estate and believed every problem in the world could be solved by a transaction. I talked to Ron Kessler at Ridgepoint Realty yesterday. He thinks we can move it fast. The acreage alone is worth $700,000, maybe more with the water frontage. The house needs work, but the land is the real asset. What about Mom's things? That was Christine, 53, the middle child, the one Agnes had always believed possessed the most empathy of the 3, though that belief was being tested severely by the casual tone of her daughter's voice. She's got 60 years of stuff in that house. Furniture, clothes, Dad's workshop, all of it. Estate sale, said Kevin, the youngest at 49, and the one who had always been the most transparent about his impatience with anything that couldn't be monetized. We hire a company, they come in, price everything, run a weekend sale, haul away what doesn't sell. I've already looked into it. There's a company in Asheville that specializes in rural estate liquidations. They take 30% but handle everything. She's not dead, Christine said, and for one brief moment Agnes felt a flicker of hope that at least one of her children remembered she was a living person and not a portfolio to be restructured. But Christine's next words extinguished that hope like a boot on a match. She's not dead, but she's not going back to that farm either. You heard what Dr. Patel said. Even if she recovers fully, which he said is unlikely at her age, she can't live alone anymore. Not after something like this. She'll need full-time care, assisted living at minimum, probably skilled nursing. The farm is done for her whether she accepts it or not. She won't accept it, David said, and Agnes detected something in his voice that might have been guilt or might have been irritation. With David, the two emotions had always sounded remarkably similar. You know how she is about that place. She thinks it's sacred ground. Dad built half of it with his own hands. She'll fight us on selling it. She can't fight us if she can't walk, Kevin said, and the bluntness of it, the raw calculation in her youngest son's voice, hit Agnes like a physical blow that hurt worse than the surgical incision running from her sternum to her navel. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm being practical. Mom is 78 years old. She just had emergency surgery that nearly killed her twice. She's going to be in recovery for months, minimum. She physically cannot go back to a 2-story farmhouse on 43 acres with no neighbors within a mile. It's not safe. It's not reasonable. And meanwhile, that property is sitting there losing value every season it goes unmaintained. We sell now while the market's strong, use the proceeds to fund her care, and everyone's taken care of. Everyone's taken care of, Agnes thought, behind the glass, behind the tubes, behind the monitors that measured the life they were already dividing among themselves like an inheritance. Everyone except the woman who'd spent 61 years pouring her life into that land, who'd planted every tree in the orchard with her own hands, who'd painted every room in that house at least 3 times, who'd buried her husband beneath the willow by the creek and visited his grave every single morning with coffee for herself and silence for him. Everyone except Agnes. She closed her eyes and let the morphine pull her under again, not because she wanted to sleep, but because she couldn't bear to hear any more of what her children were planning. She needed time to think. She needed her voice back. She needed to understand exactly how much of her life they intended to dismantle before she could stand up and stop them. But time was the one thing she did not have enough of, and her children knew it. The farm had never been just a farm. It had been a covenant, a living document written in soil and timber and water, authored by two people who'd believed that land was not something you owned, but something you belonged to. Agnes had come to it in 1962, a bride of 17 married to Samuel Marlowe, a carpenter and son of a carpenter, 20 years old, and already possessing hands that could coax beauty from rough lumber the way a sculptor draws form from stone. Samuel had inherited the property from his father, Gerald, who'd bought the original 43 acres in 1941 for $1,200, a sum that represented everything Gerald had saved from 15 years of mill work. The land sat on the western shore of a finger lake in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina, a long, narrow body of cold spring-fed water that the locals called Stillwater because its surface lay flat as glass on windless mornings, reflecting the mountains so perfectly you couldn't tell where water ended and sky began. Gerald had built the original farmhouse himself in 1942, a modest two-story structure of local timber with a stone foundation he'd laid by hand. He'd cleared 10 acres for crops, left the rest as forest, and built a small dock on the lakeshore where he'd fish in the evenings after work. When Gerald died in 1959, the property passed to Samuel, who was 19 and already engaged to Agnes, the daughter of a neighboring family whose own farm had failed during a bad drought year. Samuel and Agnes had built their life on that land with the slow, deliberate patience of people who understood that anything worth having took decades to create. Samuel expanded the farmhouse twice, adding a large kitchen in 1965 and a wraparound porch in 1971 that became Agnes's favorite place on earth, the place where she drank her morning coffee and watched the mist rise off Stillwater Lake like breath leaving a sleeping body. He built a workshop behind the house, where he crafted custom furniture that developed a regional reputation for quality and beauty. He planted an apple orchard of 40 trees that took 7 years to bear fruit, and then produced abundantly for decades after. Agnes had contributed in ways that were less visible but equally essential. She managed the household finances with the precision of an accountant, stretching Samuel's carpentry income to cover 3 children, property taxes, equipment, and the endless maintenance that 43 acres of mountain land demanded. She kept a vegetable garden that fed them through every season, canning and preserving enough each fall to carry them through winter. She raised chickens, kept bees, sold honey and preserves at the farmer's market in town, and quietly accumulated savings that funded the children's educations and kept the property solvent during lean years. They'd been partners in the way that people who share physical labor become partners, each knowing the other's rhythms and capabilities without needing to discuss them. Samuel handled the heavy construction, the equipment, the orchard, the structural maintenance. Agnes handled the garden, the animals, the finances, the household, and the emotional architecture of a family of 5. Together they'd created something that neither could have built alone, a place that felt complete, that felt finished, that felt like exactly what they'd always intended it to be. Samuel had died in 2017, at 75, from pancreatic cancer that had been diagnosed too late and moved too fast. He'd lasted 4 months from diagnosis to death, and Agnes had cared for him at home for every one of those months, refusing hospice, refusing hospital admission, insisting that the man who'd built this house with his own hands would leave this world from inside it. She'd been alone on the farm for 6 years since then, and she'd managed it with the quiet competence of a woman who'd spent 6 decades learning every inch of the property and every skill required to maintain it. She couldn't do the heavy work anymore. She knew that. She hired a local teenager to mow, paid a handyman for repairs beyond her capability, and let the farthest acres return to wildness since she couldn't maintain them alone. But the house was clean, the garden was productive, the orchard still bore fruit, and Agnes was, by any honest measure, living independently, competently, and contentedly on her own terms. Her children didn't see it that way. David, Christine, and Kevin had all left the farm as soon as they were old enough to leave, drawn to cities and careers and lives that bore no resemblance to the rural existence they'd grown up in. David was in Charlotte, running a commercial real estate firm that specialized in retail development. Christine was in Raleigh, working as a hospital administrator. Kevin was in Atlanta, doing something in technology consulting that Agnes had never fully understood despite his attempts to explain it, each attempt making it sound more abstract and less real than the last. They visited the farm infrequently, usually holidays, sometimes a random weekend in summer when they wanted to swim in the lake or sit on the porch and pretend they still appreciated country living. Their visits had become shorter and more perfunctory over the years, especially after Samuel died, and the farm lost whatever nostalgic appeal their father's presence had provided. Agnes had noticed the change but hadn't complained about it. She'd learned long ago that you couldn't make people want what they didn't want, and her children didn't want the farm. They never had. What they wanted was the value of the farm, the number on a spreadsheet, the equity locked in 43 acres of lakefront property in a region where land prices had been climbing steadily for 2 decades. Agnes knew this because Kevin had mentioned it at least 3 times in the past year, each time more directly than the last, always framed as concern for her financial security, but always landing with the unmistakable weight of a man calculating his inheritance. The aneurysm had given them their opportunity. Agnes understood this with the cold clarity of someone who'd spent 78 years reading the motivations of people she loved, and it devastated her. Not because she was surprised exactly. She'd seen the trajectory, but because the speed of it, the efficiency with which they'd moved from her emergency surgery to listing the property, revealed a readiness that suggested they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of crisis. They'd had a plan. They'd been prepared. And now they were executing it while she lay in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to stand, unable to do anything except listen through glass walls as her life was parceled out and priced. Agnes spent 3 weeks in the hospital and another 4 weeks in a rehabilitation facility, learning to walk again with the careful, shuffling steps of someone whose body had been opened and reassembled and was still deciding whether to trust itself. During those 7 weeks, her children sold the farm. They did it legally, using a power of attorney that Agnes had signed years earlier during a routine estate planning session, a document she'd agreed to at the time because Samuel had just died and her children had assured her it was a standard precaution, nothing that would ever be used without her explicit consent. They'd lied, or perhaps they'd meant it at the time and simply found it convenient to reinterpret consent when the numbers were large enough to justify reinterpretation. David handled the sale personally, leveraging his real estate connections to find a buyer quickly, a development company from Charlotte that planned to subdivide the 43 acres into luxury lakefront lots and build vacation homes for wealthy professionals seeking mountain retreats. The sale closed in 5 weeks at $875,000, a number that meant nothing to Agnes except the precise dollar value her children had assigned to 61 years of her life. They told her about it on a Tuesday afternoon in the rehabilitation facility, the 3 of them arranged around her bed in a configuration that felt rehearsed. David did most of the talking, his real estate voice smooth and professional, explaining the transaction as if he were presenting a quarterly earnings report to investors rather than informing his mother that her home no longer existed. "The sale went through last Friday," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We got an excellent price, well above market value for the acreage. The proceeds are in an escrow account, earmarked for your long-term care. We've identified several excellent assisted living facilities in the Raleigh area, close to Christine, so she can visit regularly, with full medical support and beautiful grounds. You'll be very comfortable." Agnes looked at her son, at the man she'd carried inside her body for 9 months, nursed at her breast, watched take his first steps across the kitchen floor she'd mopped that morning, and felt something inside her chest that was worse than the aneurysm, worse than the surgery, worse than the 2 times her heart had stopped on the operating table. She felt the complete severance of trust, the final breaking of something that could not be repaired because repair requires a foundation, and her children had just sold the foundation. "You sold my home," she said, and her voice was quiet and flat and carried the terrible weight of absolute comprehension. "You sold my home while I was in a hospital bed recovering from surgery, while I couldn't speak, while I couldn't stand, while I couldn't stop you. "Mom, we did what was best for you," Christine said, and Agnes noticed that her daughter's eyes were red, which meant she'd been crying recently, which meant she knew what they'd done was wrong but had done it anyway. The crying made it worse, not better. Guilt without correction was just self-indulgence. "You sold everything," Agnes continued, her voice still that terrible quiet. "The house your father built. The orchard we planted together. The garden I've tended for 60 years. Your father's workshop. His tools. The porch where I've drunk my morning coffee for half a century. You sold all of it while I was unconscious, and you used a piece of paper I signed in good faith to do it." The power of attorney was legally valid, David said, and Agnes almost laughed at the obscenity of her son defending the sale of her life with the language of contract law. "We consulted with an attorney before proceeding. Everything was done properly and legally." "Legal and right are not the same thing, David. You know that." "Mom," Kevin jumped in, his voice carrying that particular blend of impatience and false sympathy that Agnes had learned to recognize as Kevin's way of managing conversations he wanted to end quickly. "The farm was too much for you even before the surgery. You were 78 years old, living alone on 43 acres with no help and no backup plan. The aneurysm proved that. You could have died on that kitchen floor if the mail carrier hadn't noticed you hadn't picked up your mail and called for a welfare check. We had to act. We had a responsibility." "A responsibility," Agnes repeated, the word tasting like ash. "To whom? To me? Or to the $875,000 sitting in an escrow account with your names on it?" The silence that followed was long and specific and told Agnes everything she needed to know about the motivations her children would never admit to directly. They'd sold her home, taken her autonomy, decided her future, and they expected her to be grateful because the numbers on the spreadsheet were favorable. Agnes said nothing else that afternoon. She let them talk, let them show her brochures for assisted living facilities with names like Sunrise Gardens and Tranquil Meadows, places designed to sound like parks, but that functioned as warehouses for people whose families had decided they were finished being inconvenient. She nodded at appropriate moments, asked no questions, and gave no indication of what she was thinking behind her carefully composed expression. Because Agnes Marlowe was thinking about one thing and one thing only, the one piece of the property her children had never known about, had never seen, had never once asked about or shown interest in during their entire lives. The boathouse. It sat at the far southern end of the property, past the orchard, past the meadow, past the tree line, on a stretch of lakeshore that was hidden from the main house by a dense stand of old-growth hemlock that Samuel's father, Gerald, had deliberately left uncleared. You couldn't see the boathouse from the house or from the road or from any angle that a casual visitor or even a regular resident might occupy. You had to know it was there, and you had to walk a specific path through those hemlocks to reach it, a path that had been allowed to grow over decades ago until it was invisible to anyone who didn't already know where to look. Gerald had built the boathouse in 1948, 7 years after buying the property. It wasn't really a boathouse in the traditional sense, though it did sit at the water's edge and had originally housed a small wooden fishing boat. It was more of a structure, a solid building of stone and timber with a heavy door and a foundation that went deeper than a simple lakeside shed would require. Gerald had built it to last, had over-engineered it significantly for its apparent purpose, and had sealed it shut in 1957 with a padlock and chain and a quiet instruction to his son Samuel that the boathouse was not to be opened again. Samuel had honored his father's instruction without question for his entire life. He'd told Agnes about the boathouse when they married in 1962, had shown her where it was, had given her the key that Gerald had entrusted to him, and had said only this: "My father sealed that building when I was 17. He told me it wasn't to be opened until the right time, and that I'd know when the right time was. I never felt the right time came. Maybe you will." Agnes had kept the key for 61 years. She'd visited the boathouse occasionally over the decades, walking the hidden path through the hemlocks to stand before the heavy door with its rusted chain and padlock, wondering what Gerald had placed inside and why he'd sealed it away. She'd been curious, but never compelled to open it. Samuel had asked her to wait for the right time, and she'd trusted his judgment even after he was gone. Now, lying in the rehabilitation facility while her children disposed of her life with the efficiency of auctioneers, Agnes realized with sudden, piercing clarity that the right time had finally arrived. The farm was sold. The house was gone. The orchard and the garden and the workshop and the porch where she'd drunk her morning coffee. All of it had been converted to numbers on a spreadsheet and transferred to strangers who would bulldoze everything and build vacation homes for people who'd never planted a seed or swung a hammer in their lives. But the boathouse remained. Her children didn't know about it because Samuel had never told them about it, had never mentioned it, had deliberately kept it secret the way his father had kept it secret before him. The surveyors who'd assessed the property for the sale might have noted the structure if they'd walked the entire shoreline, but the hemlocks were thick and the path was invisible, and surveyors working on a rushed 5-week timeline for an eager buyer didn't walk every inch of 43 acres of dense forest. The boathouse was not mentioned in the deed transfer. It wasn't marked on any survey map Agnes had ever seen. It sat on a portion of the shoreline that might technically belong to the new owners now, but they didn't know it was there, and neither did her children. The key was in Agnes's purse, in the small zippered pocket where she'd kept it for decades. Her children had brought her purse to the hospital along with a few changes of clothes and her medications. They'd gone through the main compartments looking for insurance cards and identification, but they hadn't checked the small zippered pocket because they didn't know to look there, and because the key, old and blackened and unremarkable, wouldn't have meant anything to them even if they'd found it. Agnes closed her hand around the key through the fabric of her purse and felt its weight and warmth and the rough texture of decades of oxidation. She didn't know what was inside the boathouse. She didn't know why Gerald had sealed it in 1957 or what he'd meant by the right time. But she knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from 78 years of living close to the earth and trusting the instincts that closeness develops, that whatever was behind that door had been waiting for her. That Gerald, a man she'd never met, but whose house she'd lived in and whose land she'd tended and whose son she'd loved for 65 years, had placed something there that was meant to be found by someone who needed it desperately. Agnes needed it desperately now. She needed it because everything else had been taken from her. The home, the land, the autonomy, the right to decide where and how to live her remaining years. Her children had stripped it all away with legal documents and good intentions and the particular cruelty of people who believe that love and control are the same thing. She would get to that boathouse. She didn't know how yet. She was 78 years old, recovering from surgery that had nearly killed her, unable to walk more than 50 steps without resting, and about to be installed in an assisted living facility she hadn't chosen in a city she didn't want to live in. The obstacles were enormous and the odds were terrible, and every practical calculation said it was impossible. But Agnes Marlowe had spent 61 years on a farm where impossible things happened every spring, where dead-looking ground broke open with green life, where bare branches flowered, where seeds no bigger than a pinhead became trees that outlived the people who planted them. She knew something about impossible things. She knew they only stayed impossible until someone decided they weren't. She would get to the boathouse. She would open the door Gerald had sealed 66 years ago. She would find what had been left for her. And when she did, the children who had sold her home while she lay unconscious, who had reduced her life to a transaction, who had treated her autonomy as something that expired with age and illness, those children would learn what their mother was made of, what the Marlowe women had always been made of, something far harder and more enduring than anything that could be bought or sold or written on a legal document. Agnes closed her eyes and began to plan. The assisted living facility Christine had chosen was called Laurel Ridge Commons, and it occupied a converted office building on the outskirts of Raleigh that had been redesigned to look residential but still felt, in every way that mattered, like an institution. The hallways were wide enough for wheelchairs and smelled permanently of industrial cleaning solution and reheated food. The rooms were called apartments but were really single rooms with attached bathrooms, each one identical to the next, each one decorated in the same inoffensive beige and sage palette that someone in a corporate office had decided was calming for elderly residents. Agnes's room had a window that overlooked the parking lot. She could see Christine's silver Lexus when her daughter visited, which was twice a week at first, then once a week, then every other week as the novelty of maternal obligation wore thin and the demands of Christine's own life reasserted themselves. David called on Sundays, brief conversations that followed a script so predictable Agnes could have recited both sides from memory. Kevin texted occasionally, Short messages that conveyed nothing except the fact that he'd remembered she existed for 30 seconds between meetings. Agnes cooperated with everything. She attended physical therapy 3 times a week and worked harder than her therapist expected, rebuilding strength in her legs and core with the focused determination of someone training for a specific event that nobody else knew about. She took her medications on schedule, ate the bland institutional food without complaint, participated in the group activities the staff organized with cheerful obedience, and gave every outward appearance of a woman who had accepted her circumstances and was adjusting to her new life with grace and resignation. She was doing none of those things. She was planning. The physical therapy was not for general health. It was preparation. Agnes needed to walk a half-mile through dense forest on uneven ground, and she needed to do it without collapsing. She needed her legs to carry her down a path that hadn't been maintained in decades, over roots and rocks and the accumulated debris of years. She needed stamina she didn't currently possess, and she was building it methodically, adding distance and difficulty to her therapy sessions in ways that her therapist interpreted as admirable motivation and Agnes understood as mission-critical training. She needed information, too, and she gathered it carefully during Christine's visits, asking questions that sounded like the harmless curiosity of an old woman making conversation but were actually reconnaissance. How was the old property doing? Had the new owners started building yet? Had anyone been out to the land recently? Christine answered readily, pleased that her mother seemed to be taking an interest in practical matters rather than dwelling on resentment. The developers had purchased the property but hadn't begun construction yet. Permitting and environmental reviews were taking longer than expected. The land was sitting empty for now, the house still standing but scheduled for demolition in the spring. Nobody was living there. Nobody was visiting regularly. The property was essentially abandoned, waiting for bureaucracy to clear the way for bulldozers. Agnes filed every piece of information away and continued planning. She needed transportation. She couldn't drive. Her license had been surrendered after the surgery on her children's insistence, and even if she'd had one, she didn't have a car. The farm was 4 hours from Raleigh by highway, deep in the mountain foothills on roads that grew narrower and more remote the closer you got. A bus would take her to Asheville, but from Asheville to the property was another 90 minutes through winding mountain roads that no public transit served. The solution came from an unexpected source. Martha Kinney was 81 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lived 3 doors down from Agnes at Laurel Ridge Commons, and who possessed 2 qualities that made her invaluable: a car she was still legally permitted to drive, and a deep, abiding contempt for the adult children who had deposited her in assisted living against her wishes. Agnes and Martha had become friends over the first 2 months, drawn together by the particular bond of women who recognized in each other the same fundamental grievance. They'd been put here by people who loved them but didn't respect them, and the distinction between love and respect had become the central wound of their late lives. Martha's story was different in its specifics, but identical in its architecture. Her son and daughter-in-law had moved her out of her home in Greensboro after she'd had a minor car accident, a fender bender in a parking lot that had caused no injuries and minimal damage, but had provided the excuse her son had been looking for to declare her incompetent and take control of her affairs. They sold my house for $400,000, Martha had told Agnes during one of their evening conversations on the facility's patio, her voice carrying the particular bitterness of someone who'd been forced to watch her life be dismantled by people she'd raised. Used the money to pay for this place and pocketed the rest. Said it was for my own good. Said I'd thank them eventually. I'm 81 years old, and I have never in my life thanked someone for stealing my autonomy. Agnes had told Martha about the boathouse. Not everything. Not the details she didn't yet know herself, but enough. There was something on the old property that her children didn't know about. Something sealed away for decades. Something she needed to get to before the developers demolished everything in the spring. She needed a ride. She needed a partner. She needed someone who understood why a 78-year-old woman recovering from surgery would risk everything to open a door that had been locked for 66 years. Martha had agreed without hesitation. Name the day, she'd said, her eyes bright with the particular energy of someone who'd been waiting for a reason to stop being obedient. I'll drive you to the moon if it means doing something those children of ours didn't approve of. They left on a Wednesday morning in early January, for months after Agnes's surgery, At 5:30 in the morning, when the night staff was changing shifts and the hallways were empty and the parking lot was dark, Agnes had packed a single bag the night before with warm clothes, her medications, a flashlight, the key from her purse, and a thermos of coffee she'd made in the communal kitchen at midnight. Martha brought her car around to the side entrance, a 12-year-old Honda Accord that her son had been trying to sell out from under her for months, and Agnes climbed in with the careful movements of someone whose body still protested sudden effort, but whose determination overrode every physical objection. They drove west as the sun rose behind them, painting the January sky in shades of cold silver and pale gold. Martha drove carefully and well, her hands steady on the wheel despite her age, her eyes sharp behind the glasses she'd worn since her 50s. They didn't talk much during the first hour. Both women were aware of what they were doing. Two octogenarians escaping an assisted living facility in the pre-dawn darkness, driving 4 hours into the mountains to find something that might not exist anymore on a property that technically belonged to someone else. The absurdity of it sat between them like a third passenger, acknowledged but not discussed, because discussing it might break the spell of courage that was carrying them forward. "Your children are going to lose their minds," Martha said somewhere around the second hour, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that was impossible to miss. "Yes," Agnes agreed. "They will." "Good," Martha said, and pressed the accelerator slightly harder. They reached the turnoff for the old property road at 9:45 in the morning. Agnes recognized the landmarks instantly despite 4 months of absence. The way you recognize the features of your own face in a mirror no matter how long it's been since you looked. The stone wall that marked the eastern boundary. The stand of white oaks that Samuel had always called the Sentinels. The bend in the road where the pavement ended and gravel began, and beyond it, visible through the bare winter branches of the hardwoods, the roofline of the house she'd lived in for 61 years. Martha pulled the car onto the shoulder of the road, well short of the driveway. The property was technically private now, owned by developers who had paid $875,000 for the right to turn it into something Agnes couldn't bear to imagine. Driving up to the house in broad daylight would be reckless. They needed to be careful. "How far is this boathouse from here?" Martha asked, studying the tree line with the evaluating gaze of someone who'd spent decades assessing the capabilities of children on school field trips and was now applying the same calculus to an 81-year-old body and a 78-year-old body attempting a woodland trek in January. "About a half-mile from where we are," Agnes said, already feeling the weight of what she was about to attempt. "Through the hemlock stand on the south end of the property. There's a path, or there was. It may be overgrown." "Then we'd better start walking," Martha said, and opened her car door with the decisive energy of someone who'd stopped waiting for permission a long time ago. The walk through the hemlocks was the hardest physical thing Agnes had done since the surgery. Harder than the rehabilitation exercises. Harder than the daily walks she'd forced herself to take around the facility's manicured grounds. The path she and Samuel had once walked easily was barely visible now, overgrown with years of undergrowth and fallen branches and the slow, patient reclamation of forest over human intention. The ground was uneven, rocky in places, soft with decomposing leaves in others, and every step required concentration and balance that her 78-year-old body provided reluctantly and with constant complaint. Martha walked behind her, steady and watchful, ready to catch her if she stumbled, carrying the bag Agnes couldn't manage while also navigating the terrain. Neither woman spoke during the walk. They saved their breath for the effort, for the careful placement of feet on uncertain ground, for the business of moving aging bodies through a landscape that had been young once and had grown old alongside them. It took 40 minutes to cover a distance that would have taken Agnes 10 minutes at 50, but she covered it. Step by careful step, pause by necessary pause. She followed the ghost of a path through the hemlocks until the trees thinned and the ground sloped gently downward, and the silver-gray surface of Stillwater Lake appeared through the branches like a held breath finally released. And there it was. The boathouse stood exactly where Agnes remembered it, at the water's edge on a stretch of rocky shoreline that was invisible from every other point on the property. Gerald Marlowe had chosen the location with the deliberate care of a man who wanted something hidden, and he'd succeeded. Even knowing exactly where to look, even having walked this path dozens of times over 61 years, Agnes felt a small shock of recognition at the sight of it, as if some part of her had doubted it was real and was now confronting the physical proof of its existence. The structure was larger than the word boathouse suggested. It was perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, built of the same local stone that Gerald had used for the farmhouse foundation, with heavy timber framing and a roof of cedar shakes that had weathered to a dark silver gray that made the building almost invisible against the winter landscape. The walls were thick, the windows few and small and shuttered from the inside with iron plates that showed rust at the edges, but no structural failure. The door was heavy oak, darkened with age, and across it hung the chain and padlock that Gerald had placed there in 1957, now so corroded with 66 years of exposure that the metal had fused into a single mass of oxidized iron. Agnes stood before the door for a long moment, breathing hard from the walk, her legs trembling with exertion, her heart beating fast with something that went beyond physical effort. She was standing at the threshold of something Gerald Marlowe had sealed away before she was born into this family, something Samuel had protected his entire life without understanding it, something that had waited 66 years behind stone walls and an iron lock for someone to finally come and open it. She pulled the key from her jacket pocket. It was old and blackened, heavy for its size, clearly hand-forged rather than machine-cut. Gerald had been a practical man who'd worked with his hands his entire life, and this key had the look of something he'd made himself at a forge, shaped specifically for this lock and no other. Agnes fitted it into the padlock, feeling the mechanism resist at first, decades of corrosion and disuse fighting against the intrusion of the key. She applied steady pressure, not forcing it, letting the metal remember what it was designed to do. And after a long moment of resistance, something inside the lock shifted and released with a sound like a small bone breaking, and the shackle popped free from the body of the padlock with a grating scrape of rusted metal. Agnes unwound the chain from the door handles, each link heavy and stiff with age, the chain dropping to the ground with a dull clatter that sounded impossibly loud in the absolute silence of the lakeshore. She gripped the iron handle of the door and pulled, expecting resistance, expecting the door to be swollen with moisture or warped with age or stuck in its frame. But the door swung open smoothly, as if the hinges had been oiled recently rather than left untouched for 66 years, and Agnes understood with sudden clarity that Gerald had built this door and these hinges and this entire structure to last far longer than a normal building needed to last. He'd built it for this moment. For the moment when someone would come back after decades and need it to open. The interior was dark, the small shuttered windows admitting only thin blades of light through gaps in the iron plates. Agnes pulled out her flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through darkness that had been undisturbed for 66 years. The air that came out of the boathouse was cold and dry and carried a scent that Agnes couldn't immediately identify, something mineral and old and oddly clean, like the air inside a cave or a vault designed to preserve what it held. Martha appeared at her shoulder, breathing hard from the walk but alert and curious, her own flashlight adding a second beam to the exploration. "What do you see?" Agnes stepped inside and swept her light across the space, and what it revealed made her stop walking and stop breathing simultaneously. The boathouse was not what she had expected. It was not a storage shed for a fishing boat or a workshop for lakeside tools or any of the mundane purposes she'd imagined over 61 years of wondering. The interior had been finished with the same meticulous craftsmanship that Gerald had applied to everything he built, the stone walls sealed against moisture, the floor laid with fitted flagstone, the ceiling reinforced with heavy beams that supported the weight of the cedar roof without a single visible sag or deflection. Shelving lined 3 of the 4 walls, built of thick oak planks supported by iron brackets set into the stone, and every shelf was full. Agnes moved deeper into the space, her flashlight revealing the contents of those shelves with the slow precision of someone who understood she was looking at something important but didn't yet comprehend what it meant. The first shelf held wooden crates, 6 of them, each about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, stacked neatly and sealed with wax that had darkened with age but remained intact. The crates bore no markings, no labels, no indication of what they contained. The second shelf held glass jars, dozens of them, each one sealed with a metal lid, and containing what looked like soil or sand or fine particulate material of varying colors: pale gold, dark reddish-brown, gray-white, deep ochre. The third shelf held rolls of paper, some in cardboard tubes, and some simply rolled and tied with twine, each one tagged with a small label written in handwriting Agnes didn't recognize but assumed was Gerald's. Along the back wall, where the boathouse met the lakeshore, sat something larger. Agnes's flashlight beam found it and held it, and the sight of it made her knees weaken enough that she had to grip the nearest shelf for support. It was a safe, a genuine floor-standing safe, the kind that banks and businesses used in the first half of the 20th century. It was perhaps 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, made of heavy riveted steel, painted black though the paint had dulled to a matte gray with age. The door of the safe was closed but not locked, the combination dial set to a position that suggested it had been deliberately left accessible for someone who knew to come looking. "Agnes," Martha said from the doorway, her voice carrying an awe that Agnes felt in her own chest. "What is all this?" Agnes didn't answer immediately. She was looking at something attached to the front of the safe, taped there with a precision that had survived 6 decades. An envelope, yellowed with age, its edges softened by time, but intact and legible. Written on the front, in handwriting that Agnes recognized from old family documents she'd seen over the decades, was a single line: "For the one who comes back when everything else is gone." Agnes peeled the envelope from the safe with hands that shook violently, not from cold or weakness, but from the overwhelming sense that she was about to read something that would recontextualize everything she knew about the family she'd married into and the land she'd spent her life tending. She opened the envelope carefully, terrified of damaging paper that had waited 66 years to be read, and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was Gerald Marlowe's, the same careful script she'd seen on the property deed and on old receipts and on the few personal documents that had survived from Samuel's father's life. The letter was dated November 12, 1957. "To whoever finds this," it began, "and I pray it is family and not strangers, I need to explain what I've done and why I've done it, because what this building holds is worth more than I ever told anyone, and the story behind it is one I couldn't tell while certain men were still alive and still dangerous." Agnes read slowly, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed each word, and the story that Gerald Marlowe had committed to paper 66 years ago began to reshape everything she understood about the property her children had sold, the land they'd dismissed as nothing more than acreage and lake frontage, the legacy they'd converted to numbers on a spreadsheet without ever knowing what lay hidden at its southernmost edge. Gerald wrote that he'd bought the property in 1941 not by accident, but by design. He'd been a geologist before he was a mill worker, trained at the State University in the 1920s before the Depression had destroyed his career and forced him into manual labor to survive. He'd studied the mineral surveys of the Blue Ridge region as a young man, had read the geological reports that documented the area's history of gold and mineral deposits, and had identified this particular 43-acre parcel as sitting on a geological formation that the surveys had noted but never fully explored, a quartz vein system that ran beneath the property from the ridgeline to the lakeshore, the kind of formation that in other parts of the southern Appalachians had produced significant gold deposits during the Carolina Gold Rush of the early 19th century. He'd spent years quietly confirming what the old surveys suggested. Weekends and evenings spent walking the property with a geologist's eye, collecting samples from creek beds and exposed rock faces, panning the sediment in the streams that fed Stillwater Lake. And what he'd found had exceeded his most optimistic projections. The quartz vein beneath the property contained gold, not in the scattered trace amounts that teased amateur prospectors throughout the region, but in concentrated deposits that Gerald's professional training told him were extraordinarily significant. He'd kept the discovery completely secret. In the letter, he explained why with a clarity that made Agnes's chest tighten with recognition. The men who controlled the county in the 1940s and 1950s, the politicians and businessmen and landowners who ran everything, had a long history of using legal mechanisms to seize mineral rights from small property owners who discovered valuable deposits on their land. Gerald had watched it happen to 3 of his neighbors, men who'd found modest mineral deposits and reported them honestly, only to find their mineral rights condemned through eminent domain proceedings and transferred to mining companies owned by the county's power brokers. The legal theft was systematic, well documented in county records if anyone cared to look, and utterly ruthless. Gerald had decided he would not report his discovery. Instead, he would mine it himself, quietly, in small amounts, processing the ore in the boathouse he'd built specifically for that purpose, extracting gold with techniques he'd learned during his university training, and storing the results until a time came when it was safe to reveal what the property held. A time when the men who would steal it were dead or powerless. A time when his family could benefit without losing everything to corruption. The jars on the shelves, Agnes realized as she read, were geological samples. The rolls of paper were maps, Gerald's hand-drawn surveys of the quartz vein system showing its path beneath the property and the locations where he'd extracted material. The wooden crates sealed with wax contained his processed output, the gold he'd extracted over 15 years of secret work, refined and stored with the methodical care of a trained scientist who understood exactly what he had and exactly what it was worth. And the safe contained the culmination of Gerald's secret life's work, the thing he'd spent 15 years building toward before his health had failed, and he'd sealed the boathouse and entrusted the key to his son with instructions to wait for the right time. Agnes set the letter down on the shelf beside her and stood for a moment in the cold, dry darkness of the boathouse, listening to the silence and feeling the weight of what she'd just learned settling over her like a physical substance. Then she walked to the safe, gripped the handle, and pulled the heavy door open. The interior of the safe was lined with felt that had faded from green to a dusty gray-green, but still served its purpose of cushioning what lay within. And what lay within made Agnes Marlowe, who had been told her life's home was worth $875,000, sit down heavily on the cold flagstone floor and press both hands over her mouth to keep from crying out loud. Gold. Bars of it, small rectangular ingots, each perhaps 6 inches long and 2 inches wide, stacked in neat rows with the precision of a man who'd spent years creating them. Agnes counted them with her flashlight beam, moving it slowly across the rows, losing count, starting over, counting again. 42 ingots in the main compartment. Below them, in a drawer that pulled out on smooth rails despite decades of disuse, lay a collection of raw specimens, chunks of quartz shot through with veins of visible gold that caught her flashlight and threw it back in warm yellow flashes that lit up the dark interior of the safe like small contained suns. Martha appeared beside her, looked into the safe, and said nothing for a very long time. "Oh, Agnes," she finally whispered. "Oh, my dear God." Agnes reached into the safe and picked up one of the ingots. It was heavier than she expected, dense and smooth and warm to the touch despite the cold air. On its flat surface, stamped with a simple handmade die, were Gerald's initials, G.M., and a date, 1953. He'd made this bar 70 years ago, had poured liquid gold into a mold and stamped it with his name and set it in this safe and sealed the door and waited for someone who would need it and deserve it to come and find it. Agnes held the gold bar against her chest and closed her eyes. 66 years. It had waited 66 years in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of a boathouse that everyone had overlooked, that her children had never known about, that the developers hadn't found, that the surveyors hadn't documented, that the real estate agents hadn't listed. Gerald Marlowe had hidden a fortune in plain sight on the one piece of his property that nobody thought was worth examining, and it had waited with the patience of stone and metal and water for the right person to come back when everything else was gone. For the one who comes back when everything else is gone. Agnes was that person. She'd come back because she had nowhere else to go, nothing else to hold on to, no other piece of her life that hadn't been sold or surrendered or taken from her by people who claimed to love her. She'd come back to the one thing they'd overlooked, the one thing they hadn't known to take, and it had been waiting for her all along. She sat on the floor of the boathouse with gold in her hands and tears on her face and the silence of Stillwater Lake surrounding her like a held breath, and she understood for the first time in months that she was not finished. She was not done. She was not the helpless, diminished, disposable old woman her children had decided she was. She was Agnes Marlowe, and she was sitting on a fortune that nobody knew about, in a building that nobody could see, on a piece of land that her children had thrown away because they'd never bothered to look closely enough at what it actually held. And what happened next would change everything. Agnes did not rush. She had spent 66 years not knowing what the boathouse held, and now that she knew, she understood that the next steps required the same patience Gerald had exercised when he'd sealed that door in 1957. Patience and precision and the absolute refusal to let emotion override judgment. She placed the gold bar back in the safe, closed the heavy door, and stood up from the flagstone floor with Martha's help, her knees protesting the cold and the position and the age that made everything harder than it used to be. "We need to document everything before we touch anything else," Agnes said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Photographs, an inventory, a record of exactly what's here and how we found it. Because when this comes out, and it will come out, I need proof that nobody can dispute and nobody can claim I fabricated." Martha pulled out her phone and began photographing everything with the methodical thoroughness of a former schoolteacher who understood the importance of documentation. She photographed the exterior of the boathouse, the chain and padlock on the ground, the interior shelving, each row of sealed crates and glass jars, the safe with its door open and its contents visible, Gerald's letter held carefully in Agnes's hands with the text legible in the frame. She took over 200 photographs from every angle, creating a visual record so comprehensive that no reasonable person could question its authenticity. Agnes spent the next hour carefully inventorying what Gerald had left behind. 42 gold ingots in the safe, each stamped with Gerald's initials and a date ranging from 1944 to 1956, representing 12 years of quiet, secret labor. 17 raw gold specimens in the safe's lower drawer, chunks of quartz threaded with visible gold that Gerald's geological notes described as exceptional grade ore. 6 sealed wooden crates on the first shelf, their contents unknown but their weight suggesting something dense and significant. 83 glass jars of geological samples on the second shelf, each labeled with location coordinates and dates in Gerald's precise handwriting. 14 rolls of hand-drawn geological survey maps on the third shelf, documenting the quartz vein system beneath the property with the professional detail of a trained geologist who'd spent years mapping what he'd found. And the letter, for pages of Gerald's careful script explaining everything, providing context and history and instructions for whoever came after him. Agnes also found, tucked behind the safe where it had been invisible until the door was opened, a second envelope. This one was addressed in handwriting she recognized instantly because she'd read it every day for 65 years. Samuel's handwriting, her husband's handwriting. She opened it with fingers that trembled so badly Martha had to help her with the flap. The letter inside was dated 2016, 1 year before Samuel's death. "My dear Agnes," it read, "if you're reading this, then you've found Dad's boathouse and everything inside it, and I owe you an explanation for why I never told you the full truth. Dad showed me what was in here when I was 17, the same year he sealed it. He told me the gold was real and the geological surveys were accurate, and that the property we lived on was worth more than anyone in the county imagined. But he made me swear I'd never reveal it while the men who'd stolen from our neighbors were still in power or while their families still controlled the county. He said the gold would keep. Gold always keeps. And he said the right time would come when someone in our family needed it badly enough and deserved it completely enough to use it wisely. I thought about telling you 100 times over the years. Every time money was tight, every time we struggled to pay for the kids' education or fix the roof or keep the equipment running, I thought about walking down to that boathouse and opening the safe and solving every problem we had. But Dad's voice was always in my head telling me to wait, telling me the right time hadn't come yet, and I trusted him even when I didn't fully understand his reasons. Now I'm dying, Agnes. The cancer is taking me faster than either of us expected, and I won't be here much longer. I'm writing this letter and placing it in the boathouse because I believe with everything I am that someday you'll need what's in here. I know our children. I love them, but I know them the way only a parent can, seeing clearly both what they are and what they aren't. They don't love the land. They never did. When I'm gone, they'll eventually try to take it from you, sell it, convert it to money, put you somewhere convenient and manageable. They'll think they're helping. They'll be wrong. When that day comes, when they take everything else from you, remember the boathouse. Remember the key. Come here and find what Dad left for us and what I'm now leaving for you. It's yours, Agnes. All of it. The gold, the surveys, the mineral rights that are documented in these maps, everything. Use it to take back your life. Use it to prove that what they threw away was worth more than they could comprehend. And forgive me for keeping this secret. I did it because I promised my father, and I kept that promise the way I kept every promise I ever made. But I should have told you sooner. I should have trusted you with this the way Dad trusted me. You deserve that trust more than anyone I've ever known. I love you. I have always loved you. And I am so sorry I won't be there to see your face when you open that safe. All my love, Samuel. Agnes read the letter twice and then held it against her heart and let herself cry without restraint, standing in the boathouse her father-in-law had built and her husband had protected, and that both of them had ultimately left for her, trusting her with the secret neither had been able to share during their lifetimes. She cried for Samuel, who'd carried this burden for 59 years without ever telling her. She cried for Gerald, who'd spent 15 years extracting gold in secret to protect his family from men who would have stolen it. And she cried for herself, for the relief that was so enormous and so sudden that her body didn't know how to contain it except through tears. Martha stood beside her and said nothing and held her arm and let her grieve and rejoice simultaneously, understanding that some moments required witness but not commentary. They drove back to Raleigh that afternoon with Gerald's letter, Samuel's letter, a representative sample of photographs on Martha's phone, and one gold ingot wrapped in Agnes's scarf and tucked into her bag. Agnes needed authentication before she could take any further steps, and she needed it from someone whose credentials were beyond question. She found that someone through Martha's network of connections. Martha's late husband had been a professor of geology at Duke University, and Martha still maintained friendships with several of his former colleagues. One phone call to Dr. Robert Yamamoto, now emeritus professor of geological sciences, produced an invitation to bring the sample to his office for preliminary examination. Dr. Yamamoto was 74 years old, white-haired and precise in his movements, and his reaction when Agnes placed the gold ingot on his desk told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. His eyes widened. His hands reached for the bar with the reverent care of someone who recognized immediately what he was looking at. He turned it over, examined the stamp, felt its weight, and then looked at Agnes with an expression that combined scientific excitement with something approaching disbelief. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice careful and controlled in the way of a man who understood the implications of what he was holding. Agnes told him the story. Gerald Marlowe. The boathouse. The geological surveys. The quartz vein. 15 years of secret extraction. 66 years sealed in a safe on the shore of Stillwater Lake. Dr. Yamamoto listened without interruption, then spent 2 hours examining the ingot with instruments Agnes didn't understand and couldn't name. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes and spoke with the measured precision of someone delivering a professional assessment that he knew would change lives. "This is genuine gold," he said. "High purity, consistent with what a trained geologist could achieve using mid-century extraction and refining techniques. The stamp and patina are consistent with the claimed age. I'd estimate this single bar at approximately 12 troy ounces, which at current market prices places its value at roughly $24,000. Agnes did the math in her head. 42 bars at $24,000 each. Over $1 million in gold alone, sitting in a safe in a boathouse that her children had never known existed on a property they'd sold for $875,000. But Dr. Yamamoto wasn't finished. "The gold bars are valuable," he continued, "but they may be the least significant thing your father-in-law left behind. If his geological surveys are accurate, if the quartz vein system beneath that property is as extensive as you're describing, the mineral rights alone could be worth considerably more than the surface property. Considerably more. We're potentially talking about a deposit of genuine geological significance." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "I'd like to see those surveys, and I'd like to examine the site. If what you've described is real, this could be one of the most significant undocumented gold deposits in the southern Appalachians. Your father-in-law wasn't just a clever man. He was a trained scientist who apparently identified something that professional surveys missed for over a century." Agnes authorized Dr. Yamamoto to assemble a team for a preliminary site assessment. She also contacted the attorney whose name she'd found in Gerald's documents. a firm in Asheville that Gerald had retained in 1955 to ensure the mineral rights on the property were legally separated from the surface rights and filed independently under a trust structure that Gerald had established in his family's name. The mineral rights had never been included in any subsequent property transaction because they existed in a separate legal instrument that no title search would surface unless someone knew exactly what to look for. When David had sold the farm, he'd sold the surface rights, the land, the house, the structures. The mineral rights beneath that land remained in the Marlowe family trust, untouched, untransferred, and according to the attorney who now managed the trust, extraordinarily well documented and legally unassailable. The developers who'd paid $875,000 for 43 acres of lakefront property had purchased the right to build vacation homes on the surface. They had not purchased what lay beneath it. That still belonged to Agnes. The news reached her children in stages, each stage more devastating to their certainty than the last. Christine learned first because Agnes called her directly from Dr. Yamamoto's office after the preliminary authentication was complete. Agnes kept her voice calm and informational, the way a news anchor delivers facts without editorializing, and told her daughter exactly what had been found, what it was worth, and what it meant legally. The silence on Christine's end lasted so long that Agnes checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Mom," Christine finally said, and her voice sounded like something inside her was fracturing. "Are you telling me that the property we sold had gold underneath it? That there's a building on that land none of us knew about with over $1 million in gold bars inside it?" "That's what I'm telling you," Agnes confirmed. "And the mineral rights, the rights to whatever's underneath the surface, those weren't included in the sale? Those still belong to you?" "They belong to the Marlowe Family Trust, which your grandfather established in 1955. I'm the sole living trustee. The mineral rights were never part of the deed your brother transferred. They exist in a completely separate legal instrument. Your father knew about them. He chose not to tell you, for reasons he explained in a letter I found alongside the gold." Christine began crying. Agnes listened without interrupting, without comforting, without offering the reassurance she'd always provided her children when they were distressed. This was not a moment for maternal comfort. This was a moment for her daughter to sit with the consequences of what she and her siblings had done. David's reaction was different. He called Agnes 40 minutes after Christine called him, his voice carrying the sharp, aggressive tone of a man whose professional expertise had just been exposed as catastrophically inadequate. He demanded details, questioned the authentication, challenged the legal validity of the mineral rights separation, threatened to contest the trust, suggested that Agnes was being manipulated by people seeking to exploit an elderly woman's confusion. "I am not confused, David," Agnes said, and her voice carried a weight that stopped him mid-sentence. "I have never been confused. I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from surgery that nearly killed me, fully conscious and fully aware, while you and your sister and your brother stood outside my room and planned how to sell my home before I could object. You used a power of attorney I signed in good faith to dispose of 61 years of my life in 5 weeks. You converted my home into a number. You put me in a facility I didn't choose. And in your haste to liquidate everything, in your absolute certainty that you knew the value of what you were selling, you missed what mattered most." She let the silence hold for a moment, letting her son sit in it the way she'd been forced to sit in the silence of a hospital room while her life was dismantled. "Your grandfather built that boathouse. Your father protected it. Both of them trusted me with the key because they knew, David, they knew that someday their children would try to take this land from the woman who'd given her life to it. They planned for exactly what you did. And they made sure that when you sold what you thought was everything, you'd miss the one thing that mattered most." David said nothing for a very long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The aggression was gone. What replaced it was something Agnes recognized from his childhood, the particular sound of a boy realizing he'd done something he couldn't undo and couldn't excuse and couldn't fix with cleverness or authority. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in months Agnes believed he meant it completely. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry is a beginning," Agnes said, "but it isn't enough. Not yet." Kevin never called. He sent a text message 3 days later that read simply, "I understand if you can't forgive us." Agnes read it, and put her phone down, and went back to the work of rebuilding her life on the foundation her father-in-law had laid 66 years before. Dr. Yamamoto's full site assessment took 3 weeks and confirmed everything Gerald's surveys had documented. The quartz vein system beneath the property was extensive, well-preserved, and contained gold deposits that the geological team described in their formal report as regionally significant and commercially viable. The estimated value of the mineral rights, based on preliminary sampling and projection models, exceeded $14 million. Agnes did not sell the mineral rights. She established a formal mining lease through the trust, negotiated with a reputable extraction company that specialized in environmentally responsible small-scale mining operations, and structured the agreement to provide ongoing royalty income that would sustain her and her family for generations. She moved out of Laurel Ridge Commons on a bright morning in March, exactly 6 months after her children had put her there, and Martha Kinney drove her back to the Blue Ridge foothills with the windows down and the mountain air filling the car. She couldn't return to the farmhouse. It belonged to the developers now, and they were welcome to it. But she purchased a small property 2 miles from the original farm, a modest house on 3 acres overlooking Stillwater Lake, bought with gold that had waited 70 years for this purpose. She planted a garden. She hung Samuel's photograph in the kitchen. She walked to the boathouse twice a week, taking the path through the hemlocks that she'd cleared and maintained, visiting the place where Gerald's secret had waited for her through 6 decades of silence. Martha moved to a house nearby, purchased with money from the trust that Agnes insisted on sharing with the woman who'd driven her to freedom. They had coffee together every morning on Agnes's new porch, 2 women in their late 70s and early 80s who'd escaped the lives their children had planned for them and built something better from what had been left behind. David visited in April. He came alone, without Christine or Kevin, and he stood on Agnes's new porch with his hands in his pockets and his eyes red and his expensive suit looking absurd against the mountain backdrop. He'd read Samuel's letter. He'd read Gerald's letter. He understood now what his grandfather had feared and what his father had known and what he himself had almost destroyed through the particular blindness of a man who believed that value could be fully captured in a transaction. "Dad knew we'd do this," David said quietly, not quite able to look at his mother. "He knew we'd sell the farm the moment we had the chance. He knew we didn't love it the way you and he did. And he planned for it. He protected you from us." "He protected me because he loved me," Agnes corrected gently. "Not from you. He loved you too, David. All 3 of you. But he understood something you haven't learned yet. Love without respect is just another form of control. Your father respected me enough to give me options when he knew you wouldn't." David left that evening. He drove away slowly, his expensive SUV taking the gravel road at a pace that suggested he was in no hurry to return to the life he'd built on certainties that had proven fragile. Agnes watched him go and felt something complicated shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of the space where forgiveness might eventually grow if her children proved willing to earn it. On a warm evening in late May, Agnes sat on her porch watching the sun descend behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. Stillwater Lake lay below her, its surface catching the last of the light in shades of copper and gold that looked, she thought with a small private smile, very much like the metal that had changed her life. The boathouse was invisible from here, hidden behind the hemlocks as it had always been, keeping its secrets the way Gerald had built it to keep them, solid and silent and patient beyond any reasonable expectation. She thought about Gerald, a man she'd never met who had nonetheless saved her life by hiding gold in a stone building on the shore of a lake and trusting that time would deliver it to the right person. She thought about Samuel, who'd kept his father's promise for 59 years and who'd loved her enough to leave her a letter and a key and the freedom to save herself. She thought about her children, who'd sold her life for $875,000 and missed a fortune because they'd never learned to look closely at what they thought was worthless. And she thought about herself, 78 years old, survivor of surgery that had stopped her heart twice. Resident of an assisted living facility, she'd escaped with the help of an 81-year-old accomplice in a 12-year-old Honda, discoverer of a secret that had waited 66 years in the dark for someone who needed it badly enough to come looking. She was not the woman her children had decided she was. She was not fragile, not finished, not a problem to be solved with a brochure and a deposit. She was Agnes Marlowe, and she was sitting on her own porch, on her own land, drinking coffee she'd made herself, watching a sunset that belonged to no one and everyone, living on terms that she and she alone had chosen. The boathouse door was open now. She'd removed the chain permanently, left the heavy oak door standing wide so that light and air could enter a space that had been sealed for 66 years. It seemed right to her that a place built to hold secrets should finally be allowed to breathe, that a door locked for 6 decades should stand open for however many years or decades she had left, that what had been hidden should now be seen. Because that was the lesson, wasn't it? Not that gold was hidden under her land. Not that her children had underestimated her. Not even that patience and stubbornness and a good key could open anything if you refused to give up. The lesson was simpler and harder and more important than any of that. The things that save us are always the things that others overlook. The sealed door. The forgotten building. The old woman everyone assumed was finished. The value that no spreadsheet captures and no transaction transfers and no power of attorney can sign away. Agnes took a sip of her coffee, strong and black the way she'd always preferred it, and watched the light fade from the mountains she'd loved for 61 years and would love for however many years she had remaining. She was home. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.